So this is part 5. Five-a-roo. Five-a-dooskies. And he just won, and his wife died, and he blames John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay. And I believe he's on his way to the White House. So let's get into it. 15-minute video.
Daniel Webster. When General Jackson comes, he will bring a breeze with him. Which way it will blow, I cannot tell.
On March 4th, 1829, thousands of farmers and tradesmen who had never been to Washington, D.C. before poured into the White House. They had come to celebrate the inauguration of the first president whose life story they could identify with, Andrew Jackson.
His whole family is wiped out in the Revolution. He's an orphan, he's angry, but he decided...
Why is this...
decides to make something of himself, and he becomes the President of the United States. It's an extraordinary career. It's what America, we like to think, is all about.
To Jackson's working-class supporters, their presence at the inauguration celebration was proof that America was entering a far more democratic age. And that was precisely what worried the Washington elite. Prominent socialite Margaret Bayard Smith described how the inauguration party turned into a riot.
What a scene we did witness. The majesty of the people disappeared. And a rabble, a mob, was scrambling, fighting, romping. Cut glass and china, to the amount of several $1,000s, was broken in the struggle to get the punch. Ladies fainted, men were to be seen with bloody noses, and such a scene of confusion took place as is impossible to describe. Those who got in could not get out by the door again, but had to scramble out of windows. The president, after having been nearly pressed to death and almost suffocated by the people in their eagerness to shake hands with Old Hickory, had to retreat through the back way.
He also climbed out a window to escape. It was, people were stealing presidential dishes and silverware. It was crazy.
The riot deeply alarmed the Washington establishment. As men like Henry Clay saw it, Jackson's motley supporters had demonstrated why the Founding Fathers had not trusted the masses to choose the president. Now Clay and his allies worried that Jackson, a man famous for his dictatorial disposition, would use the support of this same mindless mob to turn himself into America's first imperial president.
It's hard for us to imagine how much that generation worried that a republic could so easily be taken over by a strongman, by a military chieftain, by an emperor. Napoleon, of course, had just recently done that in France. Henry Clay was convinced that King Andrew was the farthest thing from the deliberative statesman that a republic required, that he was, in fact, a dangerous, egomaniacal, potential emperor.
President Jackson's plans would only stoke Clay's fears. For over the next 8 years, he would attempt to do nothing less than reinvent the presidency.
Jackson as president was not unlike Jackson as a general. He was the leader. He thought of himself as a leader. He understood the separation of powers under the Constitution, but nevertheless he thought that the president had a very particular role as the man who had been elected by all of the people to lead government in a way that no previous president could have even thought of, let alone execute.
Jackson's first assault on the Washington establishment was to fire dozens of federal employees, including 13 district attorneys, charging that they were either incompetent or corrupt, or both.
Most of these high-level government bureaucrats were regarded as untouchable. Some of them had been there since George Washington's day. Jackson, within a few weeks, fired a number of them. He removed more government officials than all of his predecessors put together.
Yeah.
But while the president claimed pure motives for the firings, his opponents took one look at the replacements Jackson hired and proclaimed it the work of the devil.
Some of these people were personally unsavory. Some of them had scandals in their backgrounds. And as his opponents, and even some of Jackson's own supporters thought, he was undercutting the competency and efficiency of government by nakedly rewarding people for no virtue other than being willing to say and do anything to get him elected. And so he was turning the United States government into his own personal political machine.
But just as Andrew Jackson was starting to look invincible, the Washington elite snared his administration in a sex scandal. Jackson's friend and Secretary of War, John Eaton, had long been friendly with a woman named Peggy O'Neill. Peggy was married to an officer in the Navy, but it was whispered among the ladies of Washington that she was not entirely faithful. In 1829, news arrived that Peggy's husband had died on board a Navy ship. Instead of going into mourning, Peggy almost immediately married John Eaton. And that was when the rumor began racing through the Capitol that the naval officer had committed suicide after finding out that the Secretary of War was having an affair with Peggy. To the ladies of Washington, it was proof that Jackson's depraved rabble was going to sully the cabinet just as it had defiled the White House.
The problem with Peggy Eaton, part courtesan, part common tart, is she had a scandalous sexual past. And whenever you see women and sex in this period, you know it's about fear. And there was a lot of fear in Washington and anxiety about the coming of democracy. The ladies of Washington maybe couldn't do much about that, but they could do something about Margaret Eaton, and they decided to close their doors to her.
It was a decision with stunning political consequences. In the Capitol's early years, the social gatherings hosted by politicians' wives were a key venue for Washington's movers and shakers to discuss politics and form alliances. But now, prominent Washington wives, including those of Jackson's other cabinet secretaries, began demanding that their husbands boycott all gatherings to which Peggy Eaton was invited. Suddenly, it became almost impossible to conduct politics in Washington, supposedly because of a single scarlet woman.
If you read the press, you would imagine that Margaret Eaton was some Cleopatra or Madame Pompadour. They called Peggy Eaton the doom of the Republic, and they imputed all kinds of power to her that she really didn't have.
Now just take everything that's said about her, remove Peggy, and put in Andrew Jackson's wife. And now, what do you think is going through his mind? He's just looking at another person that they're unfairly attacking, even though the circumstances are vastly different. A lot of books that I've read about Andrew Jackson, Peggy gets mentioned because it's a big part of his White House term. And it sounds like she was a woman who enjoyed the company of other men naked when her husband wasn't around. No, I don't know if that's coming through. She liked other men's penises sexually. I'm just going to say you're understanding that she liked to have sex on behind her husband's back. She liked to cheat. Allegedly. I have to say that so she won't sue me. But that's what they say.
But what was behind it was not so much fact as this terrible anxiety and fear about this man who could abuse power. And somehow Peggy Eaton symbolized that fear.
The simplest way for the president to get Washington functioning again was to tell John Eaton to accept Peggy's social isolation. But for Jackson, the attacks on Peggy were painfully reminiscent of the mudslinging against Rachel.
Yep.
The president's wounds from the loss of his wife were still raw. Each night he read from her prayer book and then went to sleep thinking about her. And the more he thought about Rachel, the more determined he became to stop the same thing from happening to Peggy. And so for 2 years, the president spent more of his time defending Peggy Eaton than on any other matter.
For us today, the Eaton affair can only be compared to Monica Lewinsky, but actually it was even more serious. Because in the end, of course, President Clinton did not lose his office, but as a result of not Margaret Eaton herself, but what she symbolized. The cabinet broke up, which was the first time this had ever happened in United States history, and the last.
To put an end to the scandal, John Eaton and the other members of Jackson's cabinet resigned, enabling the president to replace them with men not caught up in the feud. The press lampooned the cabinet secretaries as rats fleeing Jackson's sinking ship.
But a lot of those guys who resigned because if they talked to Eatman near Peggy, their wives would yell at them behind closed doors. If they were at a meeting where Eatman showed up, oh well, you're taking, him and Peggy's side, and so a lot of these guys were just like, it's just not worth it. And Jackson, I don't think, wanted any of them to really go, but he kind of understood that in order to clear it all out, you got to, or in order to fix it, you have to clear them all out. And so that's, but yeah, it
Andrew Jackson. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?
Oh, this is a good one.
If the Eaton affair had an air of melodrama, it was also a sign that tragedy was waiting in the wings. Vice President John C. Calhoun, whose wife had battled Jackson over Peggy Eaton, was simultaneously involved in another crisis, one that threatened to bring the nation to civil war.
John C. Calhoun, from about 1830 on, was obsessed for the remainder of his life with one fundamental problem. And that was the problem of protecting slavery in a nation where slaveholders were becoming a minority. How could slavery be perpetuated in the face of an indifferent or even hostile North?
The crisis was triggered not by slavery, but taxes. Congress, eager to protect northern factories, had passed a law which imposed a high tax on the cheap imported cloth used by southern plantation owners to clothe their slaves. Determined to eliminate the tax and protect slavery, Calhoun began promoting nullification, under which every state had the right to disregard, within its borders, any law it considered unconstitutional.
John C. Calhoun, by the way, in this moment, is the vice president to Andrew Jackson.
Nullification appealed to Calhoun and other South Carolinians because it was a way of asserting states' rights. And clearly that was a fundamental threat to the entire idea of a federal system. And it went straight to the heart of the fundamental American question of who was sovereign. Was the federal government sovereign? Were the states sovereign? Were the people sovereign? These were all incredibly complicated questions that consumed the Jackson White House and Jackson's Washington.
Nullification's fiercest supporters were congressmen from South Carolina. Its bitterest opponents were Northern congressmen who were convinced it would lead to the breakup of the Union. And then there were those whose positions were unknown, including President Andrew Jackson. On April 13, 1830, all three factions were represented at a dinner in Washington, D.C., in honor of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. John C. Calhoun and the nullifiers had been plotting for months to use the event to convert those sitting on the fence to their cause. And in their eyes, Jackson, a fellow slave owner, was a natural ally. But Andrew Jackson had his own plans for the dinner, and as he arrived, he felt the same thrill he had always felt before a battle. As the evening began, the nullifiers endeavored to build support by making toast after toast to the importance of states' rights. Then suddenly, President Jackson raised his glass. Looking John C. Calhoun straight in the eye, he made his toast.
Our federal union, it must be preserved.
Those 7 words sent shockwaves through Washington, for all now knew where Andrew Jackson stood.
He was from the South. Everyone assumed he was going to back them. The one thing I don't know if they mentioned was Andrew Jackson, knowing all this was happening, took a trip down to Mount Pelier, or they call it Mount Pelier, Mount Pelier, the home of the 4th president, James Madison. Bill of Rights, and just went blank. He wrote a lot of stuff for us. Federalist Papers. Was he in on the Constitution? Yes. Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. Constitution he was on. Anyways, he went there to ask Madison, Virginia. And Madison was like, no. It's federal government over states' rights. And Jackson he felt that, but he needed someone to say it. And James Madison was that voice, and he was kind of reaffirmed and reassured that, yeah, okay, I'm okay with this. I'm good.
He would not tear apart the nation he had helped build. For Vice President Calhoun, Jackson's opposition to nullification was intolerable. The two men soon stopped speaking. Then, in November of 1832, the state of South Carolina formally nullified the tax and added, that if the federal government challenged its right to do so, South Carolina would withdraw from the Union.
Really? Okay.
It's hard for us to understand how serious nullification was. It nearly led to civil war. Troops in South Carolina were marching. Jackson himself wanted to lead the federal army into South Carolina. They were fortifying forts in Charleston Harbor. This was very close to an all-out civil war, and it was Andrew Jackson's duty to stop that.
Instead of reacting in anger, as he had so often before, Jackson issued a presidential proclamation in which he appealed to the people of South Carolina.
Seduced as you have been, my fellow countrymen, by ambitious, deluded, and designing men, I call upon you in the language of truth and with the feelings of a father to retrace your steps. Say, we too are citizens of America. Carolina is one of these proud states. Her best blood has cemented this happy union. And then add, if you can, without horror and remorse, this happy union we will dissolve. This picture of peace and prosperity we will deface. These fertile fields we will deluge with blood. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?
And that's when he said, the union is perpetual. It is not a union of states, it is a union of people. And once you're in that union, you can't get out. And I, as the chief executive, have sworn to enforce the laws. Both those ideas are adopted by Abraham Lincoln in his inaugural. The whole thing is set up by Jackson.
With both sides preparing for civil war, the most skilled negotiator in Congress, Henry Clay, succeeded in winning passage of a compromise bill that dramatically lowered the tariff. Jackson signed it, South Carolina agreed to abide by it, and war was averted. For Andrew Jackson, the story of nullification contained a dire warning. If Americans kept arguing about slavery, a civil war was inevitable. And so the president began appealing to Northerners to stop agitating against slavery. But that was not what the abolition movement had in mind.
I'm going to stop it there. There was a quote. I don't remember the book. Anyways, 2 senators from South Carolina or something had visited Jackson in the White House, and they told him what was about to happen, that they were about to secede. And so Jackson listened to him and then just told him, hold on for a second. Went and got the military, came back, had both the people restrained, or he was going to arrest them, and he told them that if they went through with this, he was going to let these 2 stand by a window and watch as a galley was built for 2 people to be hanged. Which 2 they might have asked? I don't know. You 2? He told them, I'll hang both of you for treason, get the military, I'll lead it, I'll go into South Carolina, and I will hang every man, woman, child, and pet from every available branch in South Carolina. And then we will replenish it with patriots that will be loyal to the Union. Now, if you know anything about Jackson, if you've been watching, you know that when he threatened you, he meant it. When he wanted to kill you, he really did want to kill you. Andrew Jackson would have been a serial killer in some other dimension. So when he threatened you like that, you tended to listen. And they did. Now, me hearing that, it may not have been accurate. Maybe it was something that he wished to have been said because it didn't get said here. I don't know. Maybe it is and they left it out. Don't know. But we're going to end it here. Good. I love, and I'm not, as I've said, I'm not a fan of his presidency, but I am a fan of his life in general. And I have to answer some questions now. So I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. Have a good day. Have a good night-a-rooski.